Today we are excited to have a discussion with regulators, funders, and service providers on the opportunities and challenges of integrating adaptation and mitigation in local governments. So the agenda today is, it's pretty simple. It's about choosing your own adventure. My name is Dr. Alison Shaw. I'm with FlipSide Sustainability, and I am the lead researcher for the Integrated Climate Action for BC Communities Initiative through ACT at SFU. And I'm very excited to be welcoming some very influential panelists to this discussion. So I will provide a brief introduction on our work on low carbon resilience and then invite our panelists to make some comments about how integration of adaptation and mitigation is showing up in their various operations and work. And then we'll head into a question and answer period with some questions that have been generated over the past 2 days from the previous LCR sessions, and then open it up to the room. We have an opportunity over 20 minutes for people to choose breakout rooms that they want to attend in order to better understand how networks and integration and financing more integrated adaptation and mitigation at the local government scale can occur. And then we'll come back for a plenary. Sorry. So I just wanted to give you an overview of low carbon resilience. It's for those of you that haven't been in our previous sessions, it's a step change in climate action that coordinates and mainstreams adaptation, mitigation, and co-benefits in municipal decision processes. One of the things that low carbon resilience features as a lens is looking at ways to reduce risk, reduce emissions, and advance community priorities or co-benefits at the same time. And by doing so, our research on low carbon resilience situates itself really well in terms of the sustainable transition research that's going on internationally. A low carbon resilience lens also helps to manage the avoidable and avoid the unmanageable, which is particularly important at the local government scale, where local governments are on the front lines of projected climate impacts that we're already seeing, as well as the greater frequency that's projected into the future of heat events and flood, etc. While also being responsible for over 50% of Canada's emissions. So a low carbon resilience lens avoids contradiction between reducing emissions and reducing risks, so that we have to look at our decisions in a more systemic and holistic way. It builds in thinking about community resilience by tethering to the advancement of co-benefits. And it helps local governments think about how to pivot toward low carbon and zero carbon approaches. So co-benefits, for those of you that aren't familiar with the language, are the positive effects of climate action that can influence other objectives or community priorities. These include biodiversity, economic development, resilient economic development, health and equity. And we have been working, Deb and I at ACT at SFU have been working for the past 2.5 years to advance this type of systemic and integrated approach on climate action in local governments across BC. And we've found through our research 3 different pathways to do so, which we've referenced in previous sessions. Coordinating adaptation and mitigation in order to prevent contradictions and find synergies, streamlining in order to streamline climate action planning in local government processes, planning processes, and mainstreaming low carbon resilience as a lens in decision processes throughout corporate strategy, asset management, procurement policy, etc. So we've been asking the questions, are we doing things right in path number 1? Are we doing the right things in path number 2, and what are the right things to do. So in this session, we're interested in a theory of in our own ICABCCI theory of change, which essentially is saying niche experimentation for integrated and systemic climate action is occurring at the local government levels in BC with our case communities in ICABCCI. We've been trying to scale up some of the key learnings from our peer learning network that we have created among our case communities. But there are systemic interdependencies. Local governments aren't operating in isolation. They rely on funding, they rely on external expertise, and they rely on peer learning networks in order to scale up effective action. So today we are introducing you to the climate action influences and influencers that actually help frame and shape climate action in local government. Some of these influencers that we'll hear from are Eva Jackson, the Managing Director of ICLEI Canada, Deborah Harford, the Executive Director of ACT at SFU, the Adaptation to Climate Change team. And they will be talking about the role of networks and regional collaborations for scaling up integrated action, opportunities for integrating adaptation mitigation consulting in local governments. We have Dale Littlejohn, the Executive Director for the Community Energy Association, Ingrid Lipa, a Resilient Communities Consultant in the Kootenays from Connecting Link. And we have some very important actors in terms of financing climate action at the local government scale. John Cudahy, the Director of Infrastructure and Environment at Infrastructure Canada, and Devin Causley, the Manager of Capacity Building in the Climate Change Program for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So we are interested in hearing from each of these influencers about the role that, or the ways that adaptation and mitigation and the possible integration of them are showing up in their work. So I'll pass it over to Eva Jackson, the Managing Director of ICLEI Canada.
Thanks, Alison. And thank you for the invitation to participate. It's always exciting to kind of get an opportunity to talk about these things. I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm located in Toronto, and I'd like to respectfully and with thanks and gratitude acknowledge the land that I live, work, and play on, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'd also like to encourage all of you to take time to think about the land upon which you're located and to honor the right holders and keepers of that land. So with that, I'll kind of explain in 30 seconds, 30 years of ICLEI's history, which is no small task for those of you who may know us. But we're a network of local governments and their partners, and we structure our programming kind of in 3 core areas: climate change, that's both mitigation and adaptation and their relationship together, biodiversity, and circular economy. And so my comments are from that perspective of a network of local governments and their partners, as well as the different organizations they work with. And through that work, mostly on the adaptation side, which is the work that I head up, we've certainly seen that integration is improving. And I would say it's on that coordination piece, which I think was phase 1, Alison, in your triangle, where we see the most of that happening. And there's a lot of cues that we're seeing that both mitigation and adaptation are priorities in Canada's communities. And to some degree, there's more widespread recognition that the two should be happening in a more integrated and coordinated way. And that is all great. It's progress in the right direction. But I think what we're still seeing is that it plays out in communities having both a mitigation and an adaptation plan. And there may be some high-level commitments, vision statements and such to both, but we need to see that that integration happening at the implementation scale and not just at the planning scale. And I think that's where maybe we're still a ways behind. So for example, in tenders, and municipal procurement processes, we see all the time that there are requirements. You know, phase 1 and 2 of the project will work on mitigation. Phase 3 will be adaptation. And in one element of phase 4, we'd like you to talk about co-benefits. But it's really one line in 60 to 70 pages of tendering. So I think we're not quite there yet with our ambitions aligning with the way that municipalities execute on these issues. And I think in order to advance that, and I think I'm probably quite close to my 3 minutes, which goes by very, very quickly, we need to frame municipal action through the lens of co-benefits, as opposed to through the lens of climate action. And I think if we can kind of flip that and make the co-benefits 69.5 pages of the tendering process and not one line, we'll see more of the mainstreaming or the later phases in that triangle, Alison, that you had showed. So I'm going to treat that as my mic drop moment and leave the rest of my thoughts for later. Thank you.
Alison, you're on mute.
Thank you for that, Eva. I'll just follow the order we have on our agenda. So we'll hear next from Dale Littlejohn of the Community Energy Association. Just some thoughts from you, Dale.
Thanks, Alison. Kind of building on, I'll introduce a few words about community associations, so you know who we are, and then I'll kind of build on some of Ewa's thoughts there. We're seeing a lot of similar things through a slightly different prism out here. So we're a nonprofit society, Community Energy Association, charitable status. We do training and education, research and planning and implementation. So kind of covering the waterfront of local governments on mitigation. And we are starting to engage more on the adaptation side. Our 16 staff have over 100 person years of experience in helping local governments on climate action. And we've done over 100 plans, electrified thousands of kilometers of highway for EVs. And we run some of the most impactful peer networks in BC. I'll address two of the questions that we've been asked to consider. The first is how we're seeing adaptation mitigation collaborations emerge in communities and that. And we're seeing more and more of the communities start to ask for integrated plans or coordinated plans, at least. Of our 100 plans, we've probably done about a half dozen that are LCR-ish in one flavor or another. There's the big benefits that we're seeing there is being able to tell the full story of both adaptation and mitigation, because there is telling the adaptation story helps justify some of the mitigation actions and provides that full frame. There's also some good management efficiencies for smaller communities without a lot of resources, so you're managing things at the same time. I'll also touch a little bit on the peer learning networks, because we're doing a lot in that space. And one of the big things that we're seeing is it's really all about the wetware and not the software. And it's about that one-to-one connection and communication with another human being. We're doing this with elected officials through the BC Municipal Climate Leadership Council. We've just worked very closely with Devin for a long time on adaptation and mitigation coaching for all the staff grant folks, the 60 or so that were out across all of Canada. We worked with Devin and Alison on that as well. We're doing the same with, you know, topic specific ones like step codes and EV networks and retrofit networks, but a lot of it comes down to personal resilience. You know, how the local government staff maintain their personal resilience in what is often a very long run within local governments to make significant changes on climate action. That's probably more so than the technical resources and templates, which are good, but also just connecting with others so that they know that they're not alone. So that's some of the things that we're seeing out there, and more to come.
Thanks, Dale. Thank you so much for those insights. Next, we're going to hear from Ingrid Lipa, who is a community resilience specialist from Connecting Link. Thanks, Ingrid.
Great. Thanks, Alison, and hello, everybody. I'm just going to give a little bit of a caveat here. I'm coming into this very late in the game, so I haven't had a lot to prep, but I will do my very best to address the questions at hand. So a little bit of my background in terms of adaptation. I've been in doing adaptation since back in 2007. And, you know, along that journey, it was around 2016, I work in the Columbia Basin region, where one of the big drivers of this kind of work is happening in this area is the Columbia Basin Trust. And they, at that point, wanted to pivot into something that was actually addressing both adaptation and mitigation. And there were some really interesting conversations about, well, how do we actually name this? Is this you know, climate resilience planning? You know, what is it? It ended up being a climate action program. That was the title that it had. And I spent 3 years traveling around the basin, you know, working with communities on basically, you know, a climate literacy piece around adaptation and mitigation, but also looking to generate projects that were one or the other, or ideally, in the realm of low carbon resilience. And at the same time, working with the RDI as a service provider in a service provider project with the FCM Municipal Climate Innovations Program, where we're working here in the region with 9 local governments. So in any event, with that preface, I'd say, you know, when we come back to the whole piece of the integration of adaptation mitigation, is that you know, adaptation planning is very much about prioritizing risks and vulnerabilities. And then, you know, that's sort of the first step. And then the second is identifying and prioritizing actions. And so you know, what often happens is that the mitigation is integrated into the action planning stage. And, but whereas the adaptation practitioners tend to be a little bit more focused on that sort of first step of prioritizing, you know, risks and vulnerabilities, and so the high level planning. And but you know, as I, in terms of my conversations with my colleague Jeff, who was originally scheduled to be here, this is changing, right? And so there's starting to be this increased focus by adaptation practitioners as well on this part two of the integration that happens with mitigation and the action planning. And I mean, this approach is aligned with the new ISO 14092 standard, which is the adaptation planning guidance for communities, which says that, you know, the first thing you do is identify all your potential actions that could reduce risk and vulnerability or greenhouse gases in this instance. And then, you know, once you've got that, you're prioritizing your actions, which actions are best using a decision-making framework, such as a cost-benefit analysis. And again, like, this step is super critical because, especially with small communities, rural regions, I mean, resources are always limited, and you need to be able to prioritize your actions because you can't do everything. And so you have to look quite widely at the potential costs and benefits when you're in that action planning stage. Yeah. And so, you know, when you're looking at the criteria that you might be applying, you're looking at life cycle costs, externalities, and that could include things like the you know, the greenhouse gas pieces, but also the adaptation mitigation risk. You're looking at feasibility, overall acceptability, and then on the benefits. Are we done at 3 minutes? Sorry,
yeah,
we are.
Okay. Just finish your thought.
Yeah, 3 minutes goes by really fast.
It does.
You know, ultimately, I'll just say, if the goal is to reduce climate change risk, then really the most important criteria for evaluating actions is, you know, how effective is the action in achieving your end goal, and this is where we really need to bring both together, and we're starting to see more and more of that when we're talking to local governments.
Thank you so much for that, Ingrid. Super interesting from an adaptation specialist perspective. Next, we'll just hear from John Cudahy from Infrastructure Canada. And John's team is responsible for the climate lens, which has been pretty instrumental in tethering these two ideas at least.
Well, thank you, Alison, and really happy to be here today. And I'm hailing from Ottawa, so the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So I'm really grateful to be here and to acknowledge that. This topic is fascinating. The integration of mitigation and adaptation. It's kind of where we want to get to. And I have to say, I'll put that out there in that I think it's actually a very challenging space, and that what I'm seeing from a federal funding perspective is a challenge in pursuing either one of those or both of those independently, let alone together. And so I think it's something I'm really actually interested in hearing from many of the participants today. And at some point, I think I was hearing earlier, we're going to turn the tables on you, so be prepared. But very interested in hearing from local governments in terms of what your experience is. So I'm basically heading up the environmental policy shop at Infrastructure Canada, and Infrastructure Canada, we're kind of, I guess, increasingly moving towards, or like to see ourselves as an informed investor. And so to be an informed investor, we have to be thinking about things, and hence the policy shop. And that's kind of where the climate lens came into play. With the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program announced in, I guess, 2016, 33 billion, a lot of money, going over a 10-year period. Roughly 9.2 billion of that on kind of what we affectionately call the green stream. We're looking at this funding in a lot of different areas that we're trying to fund, a lot of different needs that local governments have. And the climate lens was one way to try and ensure that the vast majority of that funding had to go through some sort of thought process in relation to adaptation and in relation to mitigation. So that for projects over $10 million, they had to think about that regardless of what you're doing. And certainly if you're doing a climate project, whether it was mitigation or adaptation, you had to kind of definitely think about it and show it. So that's definitely been one aspect that we've experienced, and kind of through that experience of implementing that over the last 2 years. It came into effect in June 2018. We've definitely seen or gained an understanding of kind of the diversity of capacity across Canada in different regions, capacity within the professional realm, and kind of the growth of that capacity over the last 2 years. But also capacity locally. And so we're going to be really happy to be here, joined by Devin Causley on the MSIP program, which is also a Infrastructure Canada funded program, and really run through Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And really glad to be here, because I think capacity is a really central piece of this. And that's, like I was saying, capacity in the professional realm. You heard Ingrid speak to that a little bit, but also when we think about the local capacity, and in particular, I'm thinking about who is actually filling out the application for infrastructure, and what do they need to do to be thinking about infrastructure. And it's very different when you go from one municipality to another, and kind of what's the day-to-day business of the person who is filling out that application, and how is what we're asking them to fill out, and how are we asking them to think about climate, and how does that make sense to their day-to-day life and their objectives and what they're having to deliver for work. And so, I mean, that could be anything from a very small municipality where you have individuals who are directly running everything. Maybe you have one or a handful of people doing everything. And so they've got, quite pressing issues at hand, not to mention the funding proposal that they want to put in, to, much larger and more complex organizational structures, dare I say bureaucracies, where the person filling in the form may or may not be connected to the everyday. And the person is still working in a water treatment plant or a wastewater treatment plant, or doing the roads or building a building. And you've got the person in the financial or asset management shop doing the actual proposal, and the layers may be in between. So it's that's kind of the challenge that, from, I guess, the perspective I'm bringing, is kind of looking at this from really that a bit of a federal perspective, trying to say, okay, how do we influence this, and how do we one, provide support for local communities, work with provinces and local governments to really build that capacity, place demands on people as appropriate, but also ensure that they can deliver those demands, and that we're able to use the information that we've requested to then drive better results. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you for those insights, John. And last but not least, Devin Causley from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks everybody for joining us for this conversation today. Similarly, also coming from Ottawa and the home of the unceded lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So very happy to be here with you. You're obviously seeing some themes in this conversation about the value of networks and connections in kind of real time, that we're all kind of collaborating and supporting and working together on our initiatives to support communities. So that's kind of that collective impact in real life. FCM, we're the National Association representing local governments across the country since 1901. So covered a lot of Canada's history, wrote 2,000 of Canada's 4,000 municipalities across this country. So we've got quite a mix of communities we work with, from the very small of, literally I think a couple of dozen people, all the way up to the city of Toronto of millions. So a diverse municipalities and their needs around the country. When I think about the convergence question, one of the first points that comes to mind is kind of one of generations, and generational change when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. I think many of us are on the call. We've been part of the building and shaping of the programs and initiatives that have developed the support here, but we've done so as the kind of issues have evolved. So we've developed solutions for mitigation, solutions for adaptation. I find kind of younger generations of professionals coming in, they just think of it as low carbon resilience. It is one thing. So in many ways, this is kind of for us to get through as a generational group to how to put this together for everybody. Sorry, the camera might get wiped out by a cat at any moment. And also with those young professionals, we've seen this through the work we've been doing with Dale in the community of practice and others, is the challenge they can face with working with communities to have the synergy as well. Often younger, maybe they're new, their first job, they might be relocating to a new community, navigating kind of the municipal organization and different community stakeholders, which can be challenging. So it's not just kind of the climate issue in itself, but the organizations and the communities they're working with that can be that part of the equation. At the same time, municipalities are taking a greater interest in the convergence of the two, either through urgency of the impacts they're experiencing from climate, the ambition they're being called upon around emissions reductions, and then themselves either asking the questions of, well, how do these two relate? Are there overlaps, duplications, co-benefits, or others, which can sometimes have the negative consequence that they kind of just dump the two into a project that's already happening. So some of our funded projects, they were looking at their mitigation plans and inventories, and they just said to the staff person, great, do all the adaptation things as well. So it's kind of that scope creep problem that it's good that they're tasked with looking at it, but it's kind of do both with the same amount of resources and the same time frame. And are they able to do that? And it speaks kind of last to the point I would say is kind of working with communities to build capacity that lasts, and knowing what is the right mix of trying to help them build internal resources, internal buy-in, whether through some of our kind of staff grant programs we've done or some other organizations around the country have used, working with partner organizations, local nonprofits, associations to assist them, along with what the consulting sector and private sector can bring in. Otherwise, through a number of years, we've seen the challenge that the municipalities can get funding for their plan. They get the plan from a consultant, but there's nobody there to carry it forward in the end. So how do we really look at this as building lasting capacity on both sides for communities going forward?
Absolutely. Thank you for those thoughts, Devin. And those thoughts, all of the thoughts from the panelists, very interesting, and definitely timely discussion about both the opportunities and trade-offs of doing this and the types of organizational changes that are, that we're confronting from a generational perspective, as Devin mentioned. So what I'd like to do right now is just use the next 10 minutes to ask a few questions that are starting to emerge from the audience. But before we do that, we have been collecting questions for the panelists for the past 2 days using an app that upvotes the questions. And so I'd just like to ask a couple of those first before we open it up to the audience. So the first question for the panelists, and it's not clear who it's directed to. How does one scale up climate action in an integrated fashion when funding itself is based on silos? So the kind of caveat to that question is, how do we do more of what ACT is doing to provide peer-to-peer learning and kind of knowledge mobilization to support integration into work plans and communications in local governments, both at the corporate and community level? Eva?
Yeah, maybe I'll just start. I think one way is with how, even if funding may be siloed, it's how you structure your own processes to deliver on that funding. So for example, one of the things we typically advocate for one of the communities we're working with to do is to create an internal kind of climate change task force working group or something like that, that meets regularly well after that funding has been spent to develop the plan or whatever it is, that at least the same people or the same roles within an organization are meeting on the same issues. And if not this funding opportunity, can find other moments to say, oh, wait, we're also doing this. That could be a neat opportunity to find a co-benefit, to find that. And we've seen it happen where people have these aha moments in a meeting in real time that if they weren't meeting, they probably wouldn't take the time to email each other or, you know, do that, otherwise that outreach. Or if they did email, that email would then sit in an inbox that beeps, like whatever's happening on my computer. So I think by having processes in place within organizations that can enable those opportunities to happen is a really good first step. It's again, a tool in the toolbox. It's not going to be the only thing, but I think it's one thing that could help break down silos of the way funding is allocated, because funders are always going to have their own requirements. So you can't always make your system meet that requirement, but where you can try to find the gray area, I think it's quite important.
Thank you for that comment. That's exactly what we're finding in many of our case communities here in British Columbia, as there's new collaborations forming based on the climate action, the integrated climate action planning that's been going on. And through that collaboration, new funding opportunities are being identified because of those co-benefits. It doesn't have to be a funding opportunity now only for adaptation or mitigation. It could be for biodiversity preservation or building more equitable communities. So it's an interesting approach. I think Dale had his hand up. Dale?
Yeah, I think just building on that, I mean, the collaboration is important, not just within a local government, but across local governments. I mean, the Kootenays is a great example, starting with carbon neutral Kootenays way back, and then building on that and looking at the different forms of collaboration that's caused. Because, I mean, first of all, playing together makes it a little bit easier to get access to the grants, and playing together also lets you get a lot further together than you could get on your own, because you can get the expensive consultants in to do stuff at a scale that allows for a lot of synergies that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get at, particularly for smaller communities. I mean, one example with that we've just gone through with a few communities on Mid-Island and Northern BC is electric vehicle networks, funded through the Clean Communities Fund, which is an ICIP, part of the ICIP envelopes, including the climate lens. And because it was a network of so many communities and so many chargers, there was some material value in it. Whereas one charger in a community, that you can't make the case for that to the funder. So play together.
Nicely said. John?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. I think there's also room for us as funders to also kind of play in the space. And I think it's definitely something that's come to the fore. So certainly, for example, in the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, which is notably focused on increasing resilience and against natural disasters, including climate change. That program, as a merit-based program with direct application by communities, is not just looking at resilience. Sure, that's the primary focus, and that there's a rigorous analysis that goes around that. But the overall merit package is based on also co-benefits, and so that's where we start factoring in the greenhouse gas emissions reductions associated with a project, if that is in fact one of the outcomes. Similarly, under the recently announced Strengthened Climate Plan, this is definitely and I'd say this is kind of more of a direction that we're seeing more of at Infrastructure Canada, is again another merit-based program, so Green and Inclusive Buildings program, which was announced, details to follow. But again, as kind of per the name of the program, Green and Inclusive, it's looking at really a triple bottom line, and that's something our minister has been very much publicly talking about. She expects all programs to be achieving triple bottom line. So really talking about, sure, in the context of kind of COVID recovery, thinking about, okay, jobs and stimulus. So that's kind of really one of the challenging ones, because we're trying to get money out faster and have an economic impact in the short term, while also at the same time achieving your greenhouse gas emissions reductions, resilience, and considering inclusivity. So it's definitely, I think, what the structure of an intake, the structure of a program where you have a merit focus definitely allows for greater latitude in terms of considering a project as a whole, and kind of being able to weigh all the benefits.
Yeah, Devin.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick and add on what's sort of already been said here with one of Dale's suggestions, really working together. Some of our programs have supported that kind of collaboration model, working through a nonprofit to help, 3 or 5 or more municipalities work together. Especially if the individual municipality itself might not have the capacity or awareness of the funding opportunity, but through collaboration may be able to access more resources than they would could on their own, or maybe also find more efficiency to do something together, and there's more impact to doing a vulnerability assessment or your emissions inventory and plan together than individually. A number of municipalities look at where they structure climate action in their communities. Sometimes it's with the CAO's office for more authority or accountability. Some have set up their own offices. There's different options. We're just wrapping up some work with the University of Waterloo right now, which will lead to a guidance resource for communities around kind of governance structures, options, and best practices. So that would be something coming forward that might help speak to this question.
Fantastic. And Ingrid, do you have anything to add to that question?
I will just add in a philosophical piece, which, this piece of scaling up is an interesting one. As I was listening, I was recognizing, it's all a relative piece as well. And, you're scaling up from what? And, so I think it's just having a good understanding of where you're starting from, and, being able to then nourish forward, in recognizing that there's a really sweet spot between the mitigation, the adaptation work inside of low carbon resilience, but that's going to look different inside of every community, if you will, in terms of how that process unfolds. So again, I think it's and there's so much benefit again from these kinds of dialogues where we can really gain the different lenses, the different insights in terms of how we're approaching and looking at this, this job that's in front of us. So again, more of a philosophical contribution here, but
well, it's a great contribution, and it speaks directly to ICABCCI's work so far in terms of just meeting communities where they're at. So recognizing that climate action, integrated or otherwise, piggybacks on the work that local governments are already doing. you know, whether it's in investment planning or asset management or risk management, you know, procurement policy. And so one of the key resources that we're hoping to deliver at the end of this year is an LCR framework for action that meets communities where they're at, so they can identify their own pathways for integrating adaptation, mitigation, and LCR into their municipal practices. So that's really insightful and really interesting conversation, and I think it speaks well to what each of you is going to bring to each of the breakout rooms. So I think we have, so we can open the floor to questions and answers from questions from the audience and answers from the panel right now before we go into those breakout rooms. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna, this is Deb here from ACT. I'm just gonna suggest that people put your question in the chat. There's also a raise hand option if you look under reactions. We know we'd love to see you and hear from you. So if you're willing to unmute and ask a question, that's fantastic. We will be going into breakout shortly, so you can choose who you want to speak to more in depth. And but for now, I'm just going to reiterate a question Alicia Laval put in the chat already, which was for John. And John, you've answered it, but I think, so you may not have the actual figures, but what Alicia's question seems to be asking is, given you mentioned that projects that are 10 million or more ask for the resilience piece to be applied. And she was asking what percentage are actually smaller than that. So how many, and I know that you've said the funding.
I'm being a little coy, perhaps. So certainly, so I mean, it's doing what it was designed to do, which is capture the vast majority of the funding. So
right.
Certainly, I think it's actually between 80 and 90%, probably closer to 90% of the funding right now that's captured under the climate lens. That said, when you turn around and look at number of projects, it's a much smaller number of projects because you have a number of massive projects that take a lot of the funding. So certainly, I think don't have an exact threshold because, or in terms of like a distribution below 10 million. But I'd say, I mean, you're looking at a good chunk of projects that do not have the climate lens applied to it. That said, interestingly, we've had quite a bit of concern expressed by applicants that completing the climate lens is onerous. So that's even for projects more than 10 million, where the cost of completing the climate lens is cost shared with the federal government. So it's kind of this, you know, on the one hand, I'd say I'd love to apply it across the board. But on the other hand, it's just interesting that even limited as we have made it to projects in that magnitude. So that said, for like mitigation and adaptation projects, there's no size limit. But for other projects, it does have that limit. But yeah, even with that, we still have a fair bit of pushback from a number of camps. And one of the key considerations or concerns expressed has been kind of local capacity, particularly in the context of smaller and rural communities. So that's kind of particular of interest here.
Mm-hmm. And definitely in our work, the small and rural communities probably have the most capacity to embed a low carbon resilience lens, just because of the limited staff that are doing multiple things, wearing multiple hats. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So are there any other questions? Please raise your hand, your virtual hand. In the room if you have a question right now before we go to breakout rooms.
I'll feed the conversation if there's a couple of thoughts here. I think when I was thinking about this just coming in, I was thinking about a number of things. One's kind of the conventional asset management side and how that feeds into this. I was thinking about from an infrastructure perspective, so I'm coming very infrastructure centric, but also from a data perspective and looking at what data is available, who owns that data, who has access to that data, how does data play into one's ability to assess risks and understand opportunities in terms of low carbon. Thinking about codes and standards as well, and thinking about what we're required to do, and when projects receive funding, what funding limitations at different levels of government are. And, you know, are you funded to go beyond code? Maybe, maybe not. What does that mean for what our codes would have to do? Yeah, and then thinking also of kind of the role of private sector and private funding too, and kind of what are there opportunities, are there increased opportunities for kind of corporate leadership in that sense. So, and kind of partnerships. Anyway, those are kind of just a few thoughts to see the floor.
I think if there's any time to kind of offer one more that builds off of what John said, it's also the way municipalities procure. Procurement is also, I think, one of the impediments actually for innovation in the municipal space. For example, if a tender comes out for, you know, a climate change mitigation plan, let's say, there's no real drive for the consultants to say, you need to identify the co-benefits of all your mitigation actions and think about the climate risks associated with those actions. And that procurers are the first viewers of that response. And if they see things that aren't on their checklist, that proposal falls to the bottom of the pile, and maybe it'll get reviewed by somebody else, but maybe it won't. So particularly when we're thinking about, you know, now no longer just a plan, but really procurement to build a new bridge or a new road, like to continue the infrastructure theme. If there's no real driver for consultants to consider the co-benefits of where it's sited, how it's made, who it's built by, who it serves, if it's not in the tender. So I think that's one aspect we don't really talk about at all, is how much a driver procurement is for change and innovation, particularly around municipalities. Obviously, private sector procurement, entirely different beast, but public sector procurement, there's a massive role that procurers play in mainstreaming and advancing action. And I think it's kind of they're the unsung heroes potentially of advancing this work.
I will just rip off that for a second. That was a question I asked my team earlier this year. I said, does anyone know if an RFP comes into a municipality or is sent out by a municipality, say for a water treatment plant or a water treatment project, even at a plant, like a smaller project, is climate mitigation or resilience on the checklist? Like, is it assigned 5%? Is it assigned 1%? Does it get 10%? And I often would think it may not be on there. And I'm just wondering, but I was fascinated. I'd love to hear the answer because I really don't know. But I think that would be, that could be a fundamental change because it doesn't, so one, you would expect then that someone on the receiving end would have to be able to have the capacity to review the project that came in. But if that was on the RFP, then every consultant bidding on that project would have to consider that dimension. And it's just inevitable that you'd have a better project.
Yeah, the bar would get raised. Sorry.
This is exactly what we're coaching our ICABCCI communities on, is the power and influence of the RFP. And so one of our, kind of flagship moments was when Port Moody put out a request for proposals requiring consultants to do integrated low carbon resilience planning. And so what that did is it forced consultants to work collaboratively. And the city had enough expertise to be able to review. We helped review and ensured that they got a good working team. Since, as they move into implementation with actions that are integrating things like the STEP code and resilience into building standards for the city and retrofit standards, they are currently putting out RFPs looking for that skill set in the consulting world. So it's an RFP is a really powerful tool for local governments to use to get experts and service providers working together collaboratively. And one other point I wanted to make about Port Moody's RFP is it was also framed as a co-development opportunity. So that we're all learning together, we're learning how to work together, we're learning how to do these things together. And so that was the approach that they took and that they're taking again. And it's been really seriously effective, both for planning and implementation. So it's a good point, and definitely an area that requires a lot of work. So I think with that, we are going to move into the breakout rooms. Deborah?
Yeah, sorry, just wanted to pick up, so that there's just a couple of questions in the chat, and the one from Sharon speaks directly to this discussion. So it'd be great to ask everybody this question. Are there any good examples or resources for procurement practices for climate resilience? So what's the off-the-shelf availability of guides for that?
So, I mean, I can start. So ICLEI is, I work for the Canadian organization. There's 27 ICLEIs around the world. And my colleagues in Europe and the European region have been working on sustainable procurement and have a lot of guidance. The challenge is that guidance relates to European procurement rules. So dealing with the European Commission and procuring locally versus offering fair procurement opportunities across the entire European region. And so the concepts and the ideas around procuring for climate resilience, I think, are applicable across regions, but the nuances of rules about fair procurement and procuring within, the Cascadia region, for example, of North America, there's different rules there that you'd really have to understand. And so I think the best place to turn to is actually your own procurement officials. And then to Alison's point, the idea around looking at tenders that have included this. So Port Moody is a good example recently. I think Port Coquitlam in the BC context as well recently put out a tender that really spoke to both these issues, plus an equity lens, which resilience by definition should be looking at equity. So low carbon resilience, that should be included there as well. I think the best bet to answer Shari's question is to reach out to organizations working in this space around the tenders and the RFPs that they've seen that are good examples of that. And then the other thing is to get your work and our collective work on the agenda of procurer conferences, and not just climate change conferences that hope a procurer is there. And that's not, I think, what we've done very well. I've spoken at a couple of procurement conferences, and the eyes are far more glazed than they are amongst my colleagues here because they don't see it as their work. Oh, that's the Environment Department does that. And so I think we need to get this conversation in front of procurers a bit more than just talking about ourselves about work that we don't necessarily know the nuances of.
That's it. And just not to harp on Port Moody too much, but it is kind of our flagship case community. And as they're moving into implementation, they're also finding that their finance team, having been brought along on an integrated climate action planning process, is now very much buying into LCR criteria in all of their decisions moving forward, which is just an incredible outcome.
That's a really good point, Alison. Actually, I'm going to borrow Denise's idea here and just talk for one more second, which is the work that we've done where we've seen the most long-term success is where it hasn't been necessarily just led out of an environment department, but where it's been led out of finance or the CAO's office that already has an integrated lens on the way a municipality makes decisions and delivers services. Their perspective by definition is integrated because they oversee multiple departments and they're looking for efficiencies. They're looking for synergies among work to save taxpayer dollars. And so I think involving or seeding this low carbon resilience work at that level is already a great way to ensure that it's being done and not just the environmental person saying, oh, by the way, could we maybe also do this? But the finance person saying, you want it in the budget, you got to do this. So I think and where you put this issue really matters.
Yeah, and this is the success that we've seen with the town of Gibsons, and Manny Machado as the chief resiliency officer, kind of restructuring decisions around 21st century challenges, and being able to kind of use that holistic lens in order to do that, but moving toward implementation by using the tools at hand, like subdivision requirements, and working with developers and so forth to kind of translate this to the ground and to those in the private sector, as John was talking about.
Yeah, if I can jump in, you're sort of building on this. It's kind of fundamentally, you're talking climate change is less of an environmental problem, but it's an environmental symptom of the problem. Whether it's we're looking at kind of, social inequities, breakdowns that have occurred, infrastructure, investment decisions, planning decisions, and until we start tying these together, which involves engaging more people in the municipal organization, the community, the finance lead, procurement, the CAO, others around the organization, you're kind of a whole team solution, because if you're thinking about the state of your municipal assets, you're also looking at your climate risk vulnerabilities, and you're understanding how your energy is being used and there where your emissions are coming from. So that a lot of the issues that are facing communities kind of all converge. The climate aspect might just be one of the driving lens it happens from, but also understand what lens kind of speaks most to your community, and it all ties back.
Yeah, I think building, sorry.
Go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say, building on what Devin was saying there at the end, I think it's just interesting to think about the diversity of factors that municipal managers have to think about, right? Like a project has to serve, there's a kind of a primary objective that the project is serving, then there's a number of other considerations that have to be put into play. And I think climate, both from a resilience and low carbon perspective, is certainly coming to the fore, and kind of, I think there's an increasing awareness of the importance of that as a decision-making factor. And so that's really good. So, because I think one of the fundamental aspects is just that level of awareness, the level of understanding, what does this mean to me in my job today? If I'm doing X, like how does that practically affect what I'm doing, and how do I then think about it from that dimension? But then there's also kind of when we're looking at this from a federal perspective, I'm working a lot also with Public Safety Canada, for example, and Natural Resources Canada, Environment Canada, on, so for example, flood mapping, which is definitely climate related, but also so forest fires, which is climate related, but also seismic and other risks. And so taking kind of there's definitely, I think, as we advance the thinking on low carbon resilience, so the low carbon, so certainly on the resilient side, there's a panoply of risks that need to be managed. And in my view, certainly resilience, climate resilience has a environmental benefit, and has like, this is where we talk low carbon resilience. If I don't have to build that thing again down the road, I'm saving all the embodied carbon associated with that. I'm saving on the demolition. I'm saving on the massive refurbishment. So if I can build something resilient today, I'm automatically, one, reducing my total cost of ownership. So it's just a financially smart thing to do. And secondly, I'm also doing something good for the environment. But primarily, like that is really a financial and social positive outcome, because I'm increasing the business continuity of that asset, and I'm reducing my total cost of ownership. So it's, in my mind, it really, from a motivating perspective, and I think with this crowd we're preaching to the choir, but it really, I think, is destined to enter more of the mainstream, which is a very positive thing, because it will then, the capacity will, or the understanding will inherently be there of, oh, this is another risk I have to manage. And so how do I look at this among the spectrum of risks that I need to manage?
Well, but not to harp on this, it would be so long as the procurers built in more than lowest cost tendering, right? So that procurer had to have built in life cycle cost, these other social improvements in order for that criterion to matter.
Absolutely.
Like,
So this really
I don't want to put it all on the procurers, but I think, John, your point is super valid. And it's true. Like, if you just think about it ostensibly as a taxpayer, of course, build it once, build it to last. But we sometimes don't think about that when we're buying stuff, right? We buy single-use things all the time.
That gets to the management dimension.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd like to raise one of our case communities, the District of Summerlin. Tammy Rothery, our LCR champion there, would, in this conversation, if she were here, would say, why aren't we treating climate action like we treat public safety? And so she has been very effective at embedding low carbon resilience criteria into decision-making processes in that community, so that all projects over $10,000 have to meet a certain standard of reducing risk and vulnerability, reducing emissions, and advancing certain community priorities as well. So again, forcing that procurement situation, like forcing the discussion among potential proponents.
So I'm just going to jump in here because we're having a radical redesign of
yeah, it's totally
in real time, which is great. This is spontaneity. Hooray, Zoom! We've actually graduated to being real people and actually acting like real people. This is great. We actually are having a great conversation. 2 participants have said, please, can we just stay in the main room? I think people want to keep hearing from everyone, and that's great. So so Alicia Laval has a hand up. Alicia, would you like to unmute? If you'd like to put your video on, it'd be great to see you too, and ask your question.
Hi there all. My question is for everybody really. I've been on both sides of those procurement RFPs, both writing and thinking about them from a consultant perspective. And to John's point and question earlier, how many of those really have some kind of low carbon resilient mandate? Certainly, I would say in the smaller, medium-sized ones, I haven't seen many. And I recognize that is, as you guys have been saying, related to the fact that it's not necessarily their mandate, and that mandate, the financial folks, of course, are often, their mandate, everyone's mandate is to council, and then council's mandate is to the citizens. And so I'm thinking of research that I did earlier where, when trying, before these conversations were, when they were more siloed as adaptation and mitigation, and speaking to industry folks, and by industry, I mean manufacturing mostly, they were just words that were not at all in their jargon. And if they were kind of buzzwords that were like, oh, carbon tax. And my question is really having, now I'm on a citizens council and I recognize the same thing going on, that the words are not really the words that are being used within the people who are sort of on the ground or sort of doing those very minutiae everyday decisions. What level of policy could be tweaked, or what level of governance? I'm thinking of like the early the mandates that some municipalities did, that all buildings had to be LEED certified, and that really shuffled the deck in terms of who got to the front of the line for permitting. And those were the kind of like levers that in early days, I think, that started to change the conversation away from environmental to economic and social sustainability as well, and economic drivers, because everybody who gets the permit first, because they're LEED certified, likes cost savings from a development perspective. So it's a big question really, but I feel like I've been, I've worn many of those hats, and at each level it seems to be the same questions of like what levers can be pushed on by whom, and is it a language and communication change? Is it a policy and economic driver change? So I'll leave it to anyone who wants to comment on that.
I can comment with a story from out east, but like really out east, Nova Scotia. So not this pretend Ontario out east, which is there was a community in Nova Scotia that there was a nursing home, long-term care facility cited, and the municipality knew that there was it was going to flood because it was adjacent to an area that consistently flooded. And a developer wanted to build on the adjacent area. The municipality had no policy lever to tell the developer that they had to do something to address the flooding or not. But the developer wanted to address it. And so the municipality went to that developer and said, all right, we will expedite. So there's the lever, right? Expedite your development approvals and give you a slight reduction on the costs if you also install a protection so the long-term care facility adjacent to you doesn't flood. And so I think that's a really good example of using, and it's not influence, it's just using the mechanisms you have. So in this case, expedited development approvals to kind of make good progressive things happen. And I think, I can't remember who said it earlier, but that the small communities actually have more opportunities. I think it was Alison who said that. And like, that's a really good example of that, where there's probably only 2 permit officers and they only had to check in with 1 or 2 other people about this who all knew that community really well. And it could happen there more easily than it could kind of here where I am in Toronto, where there's probably 2,000 permit development officers or however many there are, that it would never be able to happen. So I think that idea of the way, though you may not, you can't necessarily require certain things, you can incentivize them by how you give out development approvals and how you cost those, and how you can use your building processes to advance that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Dale?
Yeah, I'll kind of bring in a BC perspective. BC is a bit of a unique place in Canada, on the far west. One of the big levers that we've seen that changed stuff in BC with mitigation is the Climate Action Charter. It is totally voluntary, of no legal weight, but the councils signed on to it, and it's delivered a lot of visibility and commitment to climate action. There's currently discussions underway at the provincial level and with Union of BC Municipalities on refreshing the Climate Action Charter. The province is also rolling out starting a adaptation strategy. So I think there's a real opportunity, to advance a little bit of integrated thinking, some strategic integrated thinking into something like the Climate Action Charter, which then flows through the municipalities. I think when we're talking about procurement, it's very important to be asking for the most important things that we really need. I've written applications for the Clean BC Fund, which is under the ICIP envelope. And it's an exciting process because they ask everything, things that you could not even imagine being related to the grant application are in there. So grants are great ways to get communities to think about stuff, but every question you ask has a cost, because it imposes more cost on the municipality or the advisor that's writing it, and reduces the number of local governments that have the capacity to actually access that. So yes, use procurement to get the right things, but be very careful about what you're asking for, please. I'll jump off my soapbox now.
Devin, yes.
Yeah, so coming in and again kind of builds off a bit of the 2 last comments is a bit of this idea of right sizing. I guess we're trying to kind of achieve some of this kind of transformation, whether it's in procurement policies or others. What's the right scale for it to happen at? Like obviously BC chose to do it at a provincial wide scale. There's a voluntary charter, but then there's incentives and supports that flow from that to benefit those who sign on, rather than just trying to get every individual municipality self-motivated or creating their own framework or system. So around procurement, is there a way to do that as well? Is there a role at the provincial level to provide some consistency standard? It could speak a bit to the question above from John or Gary rather as well. Like, when should these things be standards? When should they be kind of another level of policy guidance? One thing the pandemic has taught us is when we just decide that you can't do something anymore, it will likely happen, and you'll build that momentum. So it's really, I think, if we were trying to get 4,000 municipalities in the country to all change their procurement policies and approaches, we might eventually get there. You're going to have 4,000 very different approaches, but are there standards, policy framings, other guidance that could help shape that and help drive the change faster?
Right, and Deb and Ingrid. Deb and then Ingrid, please.
Oh, Ingrid, you go first. You're
Okay.
a panelist, you take priority.
All right, then. Yeah, I mean, just picking up on Devin's comment, I think, there seems to be a raging opportunity here to do, to actually do some best practices research. Like there's, I'm thinking of the curve, the classic curve of, you've got the pioneers, the early adopters, the late adopters, and the laggards. And so, clearly we have a number of pioneers out there who are working the procurement file, if you will, to be integrating, just really integrating this low carbon resilience lens. Well, let's find them, right? What are they doing? What is their experience with it? So I think, again, I see excellent opportunity there to make this, visible. And I think this is really kind of the core of the conversation, stating the obvious in some ways. But the other thing I wanted to go back to was I think it was a comment from Eva about the small communities are sort of in an interesting place of innovation, right? That there might actually say the things are maybe a little bit looser, if you will, in terms of development approvals or the kinds of conversations that can lead to what you described in New Brunswick, right? And all of that again just really strikes me. Going back to Alicia's questions around what are the levers and is there the language? What is the language changes that might be needed? But ultimately it's there's a body of practice here, and we're at the early stages, and we're very impatient, right, to get it embedded out there. But at a point, there's a point where it will be words at the beginning. It will be the checklist until you sort of develop the body of practice and capacity, if you will, and know-how, where this just becomes commonplace. And so I think, again, maybe I'm the philosophical person on the panel, but having, having some understanding of where we are in that curve of innovation here. And of course, let's giddy up.
Well, I think that's a nice segue to maybe what Deb has to say. And then I saw your hand too, John.
Yeah, it does actually, because there's a flip to this that's happening, which is that actually small communities are starting to put this in their RFPs. And as Alison's pointed out, Port Moody is a great example, and I think we will provide a bit of a report on that. But what I'm hearing from consultants is, oh, well, now they want us to do both, but they're not actually paying more. And so you've got a slight flip here where you've got, so that does come back to the fact that local governments, will be looking for more funding that they can access to augment those RFPs, because although you do get a cost savings if you do them both at the same time, it would be cheaper. It is cheaper to do one plan than two if you're trying to do adaptation and mitigation, for instance, but it still costs more than just doing an adaptation plan or a mitigation plan. And so that's one thing that I'm hearing from consultants that I know. The other is that the more that communities start to ask for this, the more likelihood there is that there are people who will say, sure, we'll do that, but they don't really know what adaptation is. And so there isn't a lot of formal training out there in terms of how to be an adaptation consultant. And so I've got, some friends of mine who principally work in mitigation space, for instance. They're emissions reduction specialists, incredibly good at what they do. And they're like, well, there's really a lot of expertise to this, isn't it? Just, you know, look, the data's free, we can get that, and we're just gonna, well, it's just a prioritization process. And I'm thinking, no, I think it's, there's if you have someone who's been working on adaptation for 20 years work with you, you'll get a completely different result. So then this comes back to sort of certification and qualifications, and how do we actually give, you know, ensure people kind of bring that to the table. And so there is some adaptation professional training going on through Royal Roads, through the federally funded BRACE program. But so I guess I'm putting out two things to the panelists. One is having integrated streams of funding that are called that will enable local governments to make those RFPs where they're doing the joint proposal, joint procurement, better funded. So they will get a better result. And then how do we think about certification and ensuring that people actually have qualifications for this stuff? So I'll stop there. There is a question from Jerry in the chat that we can come back to. I just want to make sure we've got time for that, and a comment from Ever about measurement that I think is really important as well. But I'll stop talking.
Okay, John.
Yeah, so I think I can riff on that and maybe tie a few of these pieces together. I think Deborah, your last point kind of comes full circle back to the capacity issue, the professional capacity, but dovetails, I think, a bit with Jerry's question. So Jerry's question is, you know, much like the ISO 14000 environmental standards, would there be an opportunity for LCR to be considered as a national standard being developed through the Canada Standards Association? And he references his son, Michael Leary, might be less than happy with him asking the question. So I can't comment in terms of procurement and whether it's an appropriate standard would be. I would actually defer to Mike, with whom we work here at Infrastructure Canada on any number of standards, and that's actually a really interesting space to speak to. I think codes and standards and guidance and best practices are a kind of a collective package of how-tos that can be referenced also by whether it's, you know, in the procurement process, or whether it's from a funding perspective, or whether it's you know, as a resource for municipalities that want to push the boundary on what they're doing. And I think those are particularly helpful, and it's definitely a space that Infrastructure Canada has been heavily invested in through the Climate Resilient Buildings and Core Public Infrastructure program or initiative with the National Research Council over the last 5 years, and which has recently been renewed. So we're pursuing additional work in that space. But we definitely have seen a lot of need and a lot of uptake too. One of the products of that actually, again, comes back to, again, links back here, I think, in terms of your comment, Deborah, in terms of the ability of, or this kind of the qualification of individuals doing resilience work. It was fascinating because I was in a situation recently where someone was telling me, you know, all this resilience work is really quite straightforward, and it's like, okay, yeah, but we also have to think it is on the one hand very straightforward, and that you think about, okay, what are my risks, what's my exposure, what are my vulnerabilities, but on the other hand, like, so this data that was recently published back in December, I think it's certainly first in Canada, but I think it's certainly pushing boundaries globally as well. It's forward-looking climate data for 600 locations, over 600 locations across Canada, and so that gives you the capacity to, if you're doing a climate risk assessment of your location for your project, you can actually look at the relevant climate data and how that impacts on your project. So whether that's humidity, looking at rusting, or you know, ice loads or precipitation, et cetera, all that is available. So just a little plug there, but I really do think that the standard space and giving people credible, documented approaches to either a process for evaluating or what one needs to evaluate and consider is really helpful in terms of that capacity building and awareness building. Gives people something credible to go to.
Yeah, and I think that just segues nicely into Eva's question about metrics or statement about metrics.
I'll go to that. I just wanted to say that it's only simple when you look at it at a conceptual level. As soon as you start unpacking all the interdependencies, it is quickly becomes mind-blowingly complex and hard to quantitatively assess, which is what we want to do to make a billion-dollar infrastructure decision. So I think it is simple when you look at it as like, oh, risk, likelihood times consequence. How hard can that be? Until you actually start going down that rabbit hole and are in there. But I think actually it's an interesting segue to the comment I had made in the chat, which is one of the reasons it becomes so complex is because it's really hard to say whether what we've done has been successful, and whether it's reduced risk. In the world of emissions, it's quite simple. It's mathematical. Like, are the emissions of this less? You can calculate it. There's plenty of documented methodologies for how to calculate that. Okay, it gets a little bit more complex once we factor in the net zero world a little bit, because the formulas aren't as documented and as used. But on the resilience side, it's really hard to say whether the intervention that I've put in through this RFP that I've procured was successful, because you're measuring all sorts of things of something not happening. Which, did it not happen because nature didn't have it happen here? It happened 100 miles down the road where that intervention wasn't in place. So I think the other element for low carbon resilience to be mainstreamed is not to come up with a set of indicators that can be used, because I don't think a panacea set of indicators is possible, but to help think through some of the thinking around how to develop at the planning and design stage intervention specific metrics. So for this intervention, how can we think through how we will demonstrate to our funders, to our governance mechanisms, whether that money was well spent or where we should or can course correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the other part of that is monitoring certain metrics regularly, right? So that we're actually developing baselines and moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to add to this, because we have had quite an infrastructure focused discussion, and that's not a surprise. No, this is great, John. No, please, it's great. It's just that I want to just put in another aspect of the mind-blowing complexity of the concept of resilience. And obviously with COVID, we've got a huge uptick in understanding of the needs of vulnerable people and how there are disproportionate impacts. And we know that if you really want to work on helping those who are less resilient become more resilient, first of all, that gives you a whole community benefit. But those groups need a whole different kind of communication. It requires investment in time and trust, investment in things like childcare to enable people to attend meetings. It's a whole other ballgame in terms of really achieving meaningful results in terms of, so that's not so much infrastructure investment, but it might well be. So just wanted to, put that in there in terms of the complexity that's emerging here.
But if we start seeing those people not as vulnerable people, but as assets that have agency to, with support, act to enable their own resilience, as well as the resilience of the community at large, if we kind of just shift the mindset of these are vulnerable populations who need help, as opposed to, no, these are people with agency and networks that can be used to enable resilience, I think it helps to act on the super important point you're raising. And I think that's what we're seeing now. The pandemic is helping to bring to light that with a little bit of support, people actually become their own agents of change and resilience among their networks, whether those are neighborhood networks or their familial networks or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Building on that, I guess a phrase from that more the disability community is it's kind of resiliency with me, not for me. So how do we, I guess, Deb, you sort of opened the question about kind of, the skills and the credentials. There's a role for that, obviously, because you'll need some technical expertise to bring you through this with the complexity, the understanding, interpreting, but it's also the generalist in this that has to be able to understand enough of the detail, the complexities, the connections, the groups, whether they're vulnerable or stakeholders or others that need to be involved, and how to communicate, build collaboration, consensus, action. And that's a hard skill set itself to find, especially when we look at some of the professionals that are tasked with this, where they are in their careers or roles. So I guess it's to say finding that the real people that can convene and kind of bring all the right people together, and how we work. We make sure this isn't a professionalized exercise, but it's with the broader community.
It comes back to Stuart Cohen's prefacing comments yesterday about the information supply chain and ensuring that we're connecting with the relevant users of climate information. And I think what we've discovered here is there's a wide variety of users that we're talking about. And I want to, well, one thing I want to say from wearing my consulting hat, one of my favorite things to say as a consultant that is a response to something that Devin said earlier, is that climate change is not an environmental problem, it's a social design challenge. And so as our conversation has elucidated, we know what the problems are. We have a lot of data available to us. It's really how do we build the structures and the organizational dynamics to use that information effectively and move it to those users that need it. Yes, Deb?
Yeah, so I had asked each of the panelists to prepare a question for you in the audience, and we are closing in on the end of this session. So what I wanted to do is actually ask the panel, pose their question and put their email in the chat if you're comfortable doing that. And then people can come back to you with the thoughts that they have rather than trying to do it live right now. Do you guys feel okay to do that? Got to take that as a yes. All right. Well, I'm going to start with you, Eva. Please post your question and pop your email in the chat. And everyone, you can get back to Eva if you have a response to her question.
I guess my question centers around this idea of it being, a so-called wicked or complex problem. And it would be on how can we work better to make our solutions inclusive in their design and the way they're thought of, but then designed around inclusivity as well. So really embedding this notion of collaborative kind of problem solving into the way a municipality works. So I'm curious on thoughts how we can do that more. And that could be as simple as through partnerships, but there are likely far more impactful answers than just that.
Great, thanks, Eva. If you don't mind pop your email in the chat and then people can get back to you. All right, so who was next?
John.
John.
Yeah.
I'm next. Okay. I'm still thinking, but that's okay. So I think I'll kind of focus my question a little bit on the capacity building side, but with a twist. I'm very interested in the capacity context as a federal funder, looking for funding to be effective in achieving objectives. So I would say in that context, if you could influence program design, and that would be in terms of what we're asking. So I think I forget who it was earlier made the point. Oh, it was Dale made the great point that be careful what you ask for because you're asking for way too much sometimes. And I think this is something we've definitely heard in vis-a-vis the climate lens, and the climate lens is but one dimension of the requirements. So if we were going to have a significant impact on municipal projects for the positive, what would Infrastructure Canada include as part of its either capacity building or requirements in new funding programs?
Great. And Dale, do you have a question for the audience?
it's, I'll ask a question, but it is a little difficult because I don't know exactly who all of the audience is. I can see the names, but roles and everything. I think an interesting question to explore would be what there's three elements to it really. What's the biggest challenge in the LCR mitigation or adaptation / what's the biggest or the most salient acupuncture point systemically that you're seeing in that, where a bit of effort could create an outsized result? Or more simply, what help do you need?
Okay, that's great. Ingrid.
Right, I'm still formulating a little bit too, but what I mean, I guess what I'm playing with is that, you know, on the one end of the spectrum, you have, I'm going to put air quotes, the experts that are, you know, just trying to figure this stuff out, right? Like we're still at very formative stages in some ways, and then, you know, in terms of local government and the communities that they're acting on behalf. Like what is the, you know, what's sort of the, what's the transparency? What's the role of the community, if you will, in the visioning of low carbon resilience? And what's the role of the experts? And how do we bridge that? And you know, what parts need to be formalized, if you will? And where are we, you know, where's it really important to keep that latitude for experimentation and innovation?
And we do have a comment from John, which I think is very relevant. Perhaps I could get someone from the ACT team to put in the ACT email so that people can send their responses to these questions to the ACT email alongside the panelist so that we can collect them, collate them, and circulate them. So Devin, what is your particular question?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of going a little where Dale was, and I think it's, I mean, how do we best scale some of our low carbon resilience, I mean, needs and responses, along with who should lead those, and how do we support them as an ecosystem? I'm, you know, having sort of been working in this for 18 years and trying to work kind of community by community. There's not enough money in Infrastructure Canada or capacity builders across the country to kind of go community by community, you know, project by project, vulnerability assessment by vulnerability assessment. So how do we find an economies of scale and right size these responses best, and then mobilize as an ecosystem to support that body for each of them to succeed?
Fantastic. Well, and we are over time. I apologize for that, but the conversation was very rollicking and exciting, and I think we touched on the real high points of some of the challenges that we're facing, some of the redesign orientations and pivots that we need to start thinking about, and some of the kind of peer learning opportunities we have moving forward in order to build that climate action ecosystem that Devin's talking about. Are there any final comments before we close? I just wanted to make one final comment about to the panelists. Thank you so much for being here. This is really exciting for Deb and I and our ACT team to have you here today discussing low carbon resilience. It's been something that we've been working on consistently for years between us, and more specifically 2.5 years on the ICABCCI project. And I just wanted to remind people that our resources are available. There's many resources that we're producing, tools and reports on how to build low carbon resilience in your municipal governments. And the goal, as I mentioned earlier, by the end of this year is to have all of our data collated into a larger low carbon resilience framework for action that local governments across Canada can use. I will get the ACT team to put in our website so that you have access to it, as well as our email to join our peer learning network, which we're developing and expanding across Canada. So thank you very much. Any final comments from our fantastic panelists?
Just my thanks for the invitation. Thank you,
Yeah.
Alison and Deborah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody. And Ingrid is,
Thank you, hosts.
Ingrid's very keen for us to pop over to the closing event of this, where they did so much work to get this thing online and lively. And I think they've done a pretty amazing job. And I think one of the benefits, another silver lining of COVID, is that we get to go to things that maybe we wouldn't have got to go to otherwise. So so have you guys here, and see you all very soon. Looking forward to hearing the answers to the questions.
Yes, we will circulate them.
Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Very much.
Bye.